Sjögren's disease is about to change forever. For patients, for people still undiagnosed, for anyone who has been told their tests are normal while their body says something completely different. We are entering a brand new era of this disease. And the good news is, there are now real ways to get answers that weren't possible before. I spend all day inside the research, the clinical trials, the specialist literature that never makes mainstream news. And I'm starting to see patterns that are not obvious to the average person, or even the average doctor. Patterns in how this disease starts, how it gets missed, and what is now, finally, being done about it. In this video I'm going to walk through what is actually changing, why the old diagnostic system keeps failing people, what the science has just discovered, and exactly what that means for you if you're still searching for answers. Let's get into it. Let me walk you through how this usually goes. Because if you've been living this, you'll recognize every single step. It starts with your GP. You sit down, you describe your symptoms. You've been rehearsing this, you've thought about how to make it sound coherent, how to not come across as someone who's overreacting, how to make the list feel real and not hypochondriac. They listen. They take notes. They order blood work. ANA panel. Thyroid function. Full blood count. Inflammatory markers, CRP, ESR. Maybe B12. Maybe iron. You wait for the results. You check the patient portal 17 times. And then the results come in. Nothing flagged. Or maybe one thing slightly out of range that gets noted as clinically insignificant. Or everything sitting just inside the normal reference bracket, 0.1 points inside, but inside nonetheless. You get referred to a specialist. Rheumatology, maybe. Or neurology. Or both, eventually. More appointments. More waiting lists. More tests that are variations of the same test you already had. And those come back normal too. You go home. You try to adapt. You try to get on with your life and incorporate these symptoms as just the texture of your days now. The dry eyes. The fatigue. The fog. The things you've stopped expecting to be explained. But they don't resolve. Some of them get worse. So you go back. And this time the conversation goes somewhere that leaves a mark. Because gently, sometimes kindly, sometimes less so, you're told that stress does extraordinary things to the body. That anxiety can present as physical symptoms. That chronic fatigue is complex. That sometimes, with no identifiable cause, bodies just do this. And you leave with nothing new except the creeping suspicion that you might be the problem. That you're not explaining it right. That you're not tough enough. That everyone else is carrying this kind of weight quietly and you're just less equipped to handle it. You're not the problem. Here's what's actually happening. The standard tests most doctors use to screen for autoimmune conditions, specifically the ANA test and the anti-SSA and anti-SSB antibody panels, were designed to detect well-established, already progressed cases of autoimmune disease. They were not built for early presentations. They were not built for atypical cases. They were not built for the version of this disease that is increasingly common, the version that starts with neurological symptoms, or fatigue, or sleep disruption, long before the classic markers appear in the blood. And for the condition I'm about to name, they miss the diagnosis entirely in up to 30% of confirmed cases. 30%. That is not a rounding error. That is 1 in 3 people with a real, diagnosable, treatable condition being told there is nothing wrong. The average person with this condition waits between 3 and 7 years for a correct diagnosis. Not because they weren't sick. Because the testing framework is outdated. Normal doesn't mean nothing is wrong. It means the test wasn't looking for the right thing. And if that sentence just landed for you, if something in what I've described so far sounds familiar, I've put together a symptom map that shows exactly how this condition progresses, what shows up at each stage, and where the standard tests are most likely to miss it. Type symptom map in the comments right now and I'll send it to you directly. Because what I'm about to show you next is why that map matters more than most people realize, and why the stage you're in changes everything about what happens next. Now here's where something changed. And this is the part that most people, even people who've been researching their symptoms for years, haven't fully connected yet. After 2020, something started showing up in rheumatology clinics around the world. A pattern. New onset autoimmune presentations. People who had no prior history of autoimmune disease. No family pattern that would flag them as high risk. No obvious clinical reason to be sitting in a rheumatologist's waiting room. Except one thing. In the months before their symptoms began, or in the months before their existing symptoms dramatically worsened, they'd had a significant viral illness. Now, this is important, and I want to be precise about it. Researchers are not saying that viral illness causes autoimmune disease. That is not what the emerging evidence suggests, and I'm not going to tell you that. What is being studied, carefully, rigorously, in peer-reviewed journals and active clinical investigations, is whether certain viral infections can act as a trigger. A catalyst that unmasks an autoimmune process that was already quietly developing underneath the surface. Here's the working model. Some people carry a genetic predisposition to autoimmune conditions. The immune system, in these individuals, has a baseline tolerance, a careful, calibrated balance that keeps certain inflammatory responses in check. That tolerance can be maintained for years, decades, sometimes an entire lifetime. But when the immune system faces a significant challenge, a major viral infection, the kind that puts the body's defenses on full alert, that balance can be disrupted. And for some people, the disruption doesn't fully resolve when the virus clears. The immune system, trained by the infection to be hypervigilant, doesn't fully stand down. And in people who already had that underlying predisposition, that failure to stand down can be the thing that tips a subclinical autoimmune process into a clinical one. This is not a fringe theory. This has biological plausibility. It fits with what we know about how autoimmune conditions are triggered in other contexts. And it matches a pattern that a growing number of clinicians and researchers are now documenting and taking seriously. Post-2020, new-onset Sjögren's presentations increased. New-onset presentations of multiple autoimmune conditions increased. Whether that is directly connected to a specific virus, or to the broader immune disruption of a global viral event, is still being studied. But the pattern is there. And if your symptoms started after a viral illness, or if symptoms you'd been managing suddenly escalated in the months following one, and your tests have come back normal, I want you to keep watching. Because there is a specific pattern here that most people are completely missing. And the fact that you've been seeing it in yourself, and not being believed, doesn't mean you're wrong. It might mean you're early. This is one of the most important shifts in how researchers now understand this disease. Because most people hear dry eyes and dry mouth and think, that's not me. That sounds too simple to be what I have. But dry eyes and dry mouth are the late stage, textbook presentation. They're what shows up after years of damage to the moisture-producing glands. What comes first, sometimes months before, sometimes years before, looks completely different. And this is the part that doesn't make it onto most information pages. The part that gets filed under other symptoms, in a list nobody reads past the first 3 bullet points. So let's go through it. Brain fog. Not tiredness. Not the normal cognitive slowness of a bad night's sleep. A specific, persistent difficulty with processing. With finding words. With holding a thought from the beginning of a sentence to the end of it. You're in the middle of a conversation and you reach for a word you've used 1,000 times, and it's just not there. You can feel the shape of it. You know exactly what you mean. And the word is gone. Tingling. Hands. Feet. Sometimes the face. Sometimes one side more than the other. Not constant, that's what makes it easy to dismiss. Just frequent enough to notice. Just odd enough to make you check your hands and wonder. Most people chalk this up to poor circulation. Or sitting wrong. Or anxiety. It gets noted and forgotten. Sleep disruption. Specifically, and this is a pattern worth knowing, waking between 2 and 4 a.m. Not because you need the bathroom. Not anxious. Not a nightmare. Just awake. With a nervous system that won't quiet back down. You lie there. You try breathing exercises. You try not looking at your phone. And eventually you drift back off and wake up exhausted from a night that technically included 8 hours of sleep. This specific window, the early morning waking, the inability to re-enter deep sleep, is associated with dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system. The system that governs the things your body does automatically. Heart rate. Temperature. Digestion. The background machinery of being alive. Low-grade anxiety. Not a panic attack. Not a diagnosable anxiety disorder with a clear trigger. Just a background hum of unease that arrived at some point and never left. You might not even call it anxiety. You might just say you feel unsettled. Or on edge. Or like something is slightly, permanently wrong and you can't identify what it is. It persists regardless of circumstances. A good day doesn't touch it. A holiday doesn't touch it. That's a different conversation from stress. Sensitivity. To light. To sound. To temperature. Things that didn't bother you before now register differently. A restaurant that's too loud. Headlights at night that feel too bright. The sensation of being too hot or too cold in environments where everyone else seems fine. And the fatigue. Not tiredness. A body running on a fraction of its available energy for no visible reason. A body that goes through the motions of a normal day and comes home as if it ran a marathon. People describe it as having a battery that charges to 40% no matter how long you sleep. And then drains faster than it should. Here's what connects all of these symptoms. They are not random. They are not anxiety. They are not a collection of unrelated complaints that happen to coexist. They are connected by the nervous system. What researchers have increasingly documented is that in this disease, the peripheral nervous system can be affected before the glands show any clinical damage. Peripheral neuropathy. Small fiber neuropathy. Autonomic neuropathy. These are real, diagnosable neurological conditions. They affect sensation, sleep, temperature regulation, heart rate, and mood. And they can precede the classic glandular symptoms by months, sometimes by years. Which means that when someone presents with brain fog and sleep disruption and tingling and fatigue and gets an ANA panel that comes back negative, the doctor is looking at the right body, the wrong place, with the wrong test, at the wrong time. The nervous system is already carrying the signal. The blood work just isn't listening for it. So let me name it. Sjögren's disease. Named after the Swedish ophthalmologist Henrik Sjögren, who first described it in the 1930s. A chronic autoimmune condition in which the immune system attacks the body's moisture-producing glands, primarily the salivary glands and the lacrimal glands that produce tears. That's the textbook definition. But that definition is incomplete. Because Sjögren's is not just a disease of dry eyes and dry mouth. It is a systemic autoimmune condition that can affect the nervous system, the joints, the kidneys, the lungs, the skin, the blood vessels, and the brain. It affects an estimated 4 million people in the United States alone. Globally, the numbers reach into the tens of millions. Over 90% of those diagnosed are women. And the average time between the first appearance of symptoms and a correct diagnosis is 3 to 7 years. 3 to 7 years. During which time people are being told their tests are normal. During which time they are being referred back to their GP with nothing new. During which time the disease is progressing, quietly, systemically, while the framework for catching it remains a generation behind the science. Sjögren's is one of the most common autoimmune diseases in the world. And one of the most chronically underdiagnosed. Not because it's rare. Not because it's invisible. Because the standard diagnostic tools were designed for a version of this disease that is not the version most people actually have when they first start experiencing symptoms. This is the shift I find most important to understand, because it explains everything that came before it. When a patient presents with symptoms that might suggest an autoimmune condition, fatigue, joint pain, dry eyes, dry mouth, neurological symptoms, the standard screening pathway looks like this. ANA test. Antinuclear antibodies. A broad marker for autoimmune activity. If ANA comes back positive, it triggers further investigation, including the more specific anti-SSA and anti-SSB antibody tests associated with Sjögren's. If ANA comes back negative, Sjögren's is typically removed from the picture. The investigation moves elsewhere. Here is the problem. ANA is negative in a significant proportion of early or atypical Sjögren's cases. And even when ANA is positive, the anti-SSA and anti-SSB antibodies can still be absent. Up to 30% of people with confirmed Sjögren's disease are entirely seronegative. Seronegative means their blood shows no antibody markers. None. Standard panels look completely normal. This is not a borderline case. This is a person with confirmed diagnosis, confirmed glandular damage, confirmed neurological involvement, and blood work that a GP would look at and say, nothing to worry about. The diagnostic tools that would actually catch these cases do exist. Minor salivary gland biopsy, removing a tiny section of tissue from the inner lip and examining it for the immune cell clusters that indicate Sjögren's, remains the gold standard. It is almost never ordered at primary care level. It requires a clinical suspicion that most GPS don't have, because the presentation doesn't match the textbook picture from their training. The training that described a middle-aged woman with obvious, severe dry eyes and dry mouth. Not someone in their 30s with fatigue and brain fog and tingling who doesn't even mention the dryness because it doesn't seem like the important part. There are newer, less invasive tools. Salivary gland ultrasound, detecting structural changes in the glands without any biopsy. Advanced tear film analysis, measuring tear film stability in ways that go beyond standard eye checks. Minor gland evaluation techniques that don't require biopsy at all. These tools exist. They work. Some of them outperform the blood panels currently in standard use. They are not in the standard protocol. There is no systematic pathway that routes a patient from fatigue and brain fog with normal blood work to salivary gland ultrasound and minor gland evaluation. That pathway has to be requested by a doctor who already suspects the diagnosis, which requires a doctor who already has enough clinical familiarity with atypical Sjögren's to make that connection. And right now, at the primary care level, most don't. The gap between what the science can detect and what the system routinely checks for is enormous. And patients, real people with a real, progressive, systemic disease, are falling into it every single day. The test said normal. The disease didn't get the memo. If you've been told your tests are fine, but your symptoms don't match that answer, I've put together a symptom map that shows exactly how this condition progresses and what actually shows up at each stage. Type normal in the comments and I'll send it to you directly. I want to stay here for a moment. Because the statistics are one thing. The lived reality is another. 7 years. Think about what 7 years means in a person's life. 7 years of symptoms you've learned to manage around. 7 years of adapting, scaling back, canceling things, building in rest days and recovery windows that healthy people your age don't need. 7 years of appointments that didn't lead anywhere. Referrals that circled back to the beginning. Tests that confirmed nothing except that the test couldn't find anything. 7 years of performing wellness. Of putting on enough energy to get through a workday and then coming home and crashing. Of declining invitations not because you don't want to go but because you genuinely don't know if you'll have anything left by the time the evening comes. 7 years of well-meaning people suggesting maybe you need more exercise, more sleep, less stress, a different diet, a therapist, and you've tried most of it. Some of it helped at the margins. None of it touched the core. 7 years of wondering, quietly, in the private moments, whether this is just what the rest of your life looks like now. And during all of that time, the disease was doing what diseases do when they are not being treated. It was progressing. Because Sjögren's is not a stable condition. In many people, it moves. What starts as subclinical neurological involvement can develop into more significant neuropathy. What starts as mild glandular disruption can progress to significant salivary and lacrimal gland damage. What presents as fatigue and brain fog can expand to include joint involvement, renal involvement, pulmonary involvement. The staging matters. The earlier you understand where you are in the pattern, the more options exist. Not just treatment options, but options for protecting the tissue that hasn't yet been damaged. The window isn't permanent. And right now, most people don't even know they're in it. There's something else that needs to be said. Something that sits underneath the diagnostic gap and makes it wider. Over 90% of people diagnosed with Sjögren's are women. And the research on how women's health symptoms are handled in clinical settings is not ambiguous. Women wait longer for diagnosis across a wide range of conditions. Women are more likely to have their symptoms attributed to anxiety or stress. Women are more likely to be discharged from specialist care without a diagnosis and told to manage conservatively. When the symptom profile includes fatigue, mood changes, sleep disruption, and pain without a clear structural cause, the clinical assumption, particularly in women, tends to reach for psychological explanation before it reaches for organic disease. This is not a conspiracy. It is a systemic bias that is documented, studied, and real. And in a disease that affects primarily women, presents atypically in its early stages, and relies on tests that miss 30% of cases, that bias is not a minor factor. It is a central part of why the diagnosis gap exists and why it persists. If you are a woman who has been sitting in a doctor's office describing symptoms that feel real and significant, and you have been sent home with reassurance that doesn't reassure anything, the failure was not yours. The failure was in a system that was not designed with your presentation in mind. I want to ask you something directly. Are you watching this as someone who has been dismissed, or as someone watching for a person they love? Drop an F in the comments if you're a woman navigating this yourself. Drop an M if you're a man, because while 90% of diagnosed cases are women, men get missed too. Often longer. Often harder. Because nobody is even looking. And if you're here for someone else, a partner, a daughter, a friend who has been told for years that everything is fine, drop their initial. Because the number of people in those comments is going to tell its own story. And it's a story that more people need to see. I want to stop here and speak directly to you. If you've been told everything is normal, but you don't feel normal, that matters. Not as a polite concession. As a clinical fact. Symptoms are data. The absence of a positive test result does not retroactively erase the data. It means the test didn't capture it, not that the data isn't there. What you are experiencing is real. The fatigue is real. The brain fog is real. The sleep disruption, the tingling, the dry eyes that don't respond to drops, the anxiety that appeared from nowhere, these are real. You probably learned to stop mentioning certain symptoms. You edited yourself in appointments because you'd already learned which things would be taken seriously and which things would land with that particular expression. Not unkind, but slightly tired. That means the conversation has already been categorized. You started keeping a symptom journal and then stopped because it felt like building a case that no one was going to look at. You started wondering if it really was stress. If you were somehow generating these symptoms through worry about having symptoms. You started being your own harshest skeptic, because the alternative, continuing to believe something was genuinely wrong while continuing to not be believed, was too exhausting to maintain. I want to say this as plainly as I can. You weren't imagining it. The pattern was real. The signal was real. The fact that it wasn't caught doesn't mean it wasn't being sent. And the reason I'm making this video is because that is changing. Slowly, imperfectly, not nearly fast enough, but it is changing. The science has moved. And it's time for the awareness to catch up. Let me tell you what has actually happened. What is happening right now, in clinical trials and research journals, that most people, including most people with a Sjögren's diagnosis, have never heard about. For over a century, Sjögren's disease had no approved treatment. Not limited treatment options. No approved treatment. None. There were things that helped with symptoms. Artificial tears. Saliva stimulants. Anti-inflammatory medication borrowed from other conditions. Hydroxychloroquine, a drug originally developed for malaria, became a common off-label tool. But nothing that targeted the disease itself. Nothing that went after the mechanism. Nothing that had gone through the full clinical trial process and come out the other end with proof that it actually changed the course of the disease. Until now. In 2025, something happened that has not been reported in mainstream media. That has not made health news headlines. That has not reached the patient communities who need to know about it. 2 global phase 3 clinical trials, the largest, most rigorous type of clinical trial that exists, produced positive results for the first time in the history of Sjögren's disease. The trials were called Neptunus 1 and Neptunus 2. They were run by Novartis, evaluating a drug called ianalumab. And they met their primary endpoints. Here's what that means in plain language. The trial had a clear, pre-specified goal: show a statistically significant reduction in disease activity compared to placebo. Not a trend. Not a suggestion. A statistically significant, reproducible reduction. Both trials achieved it. For the first time. In the history. Of this disease. Novartis has announced plans to submit ianalumab to health authorities globally, including the FDA, for approval. This is not incremental progress. This is the first time the door has opened. But ianalumab is not the only drug in this story. A second drug, telitacicept, produced results that, when you see the numbers, are striking. In a phase 3 trial involving 381 patients with active Sjögren's disease, telitacicept was compared to placebo. In the 160 mg dose group, 71.8% of patients achieved a clinically meaningful reduction in disease activity at 24 weeks. In the placebo group, 19.3%. Nearly 3 out of 4 patients on the active drug hit the target. Fewer than 1 in 5 on placebo. And the improvements continued at 48 weeks, sustained, not fading. Telitacicept works by neutralizing 2 specific signals. BLIS and APRIL, that B cells depend on to survive and proliferate. Cut off both signals simultaneously, and the B cells driving the autoimmune attack lose their support system. Not carpet bombing the entire immune system. Targeting the specific cells producing the specific problem. And then there's nipocalimab, from Johnson & Johnson. This one works through a mechanism that sounds almost elegant when you understand it. The rogue antibodies attacking the moisture-producing glands, the IgG autoantibodies, don't just get produced and naturally degrade. They get recycled. There's a receptor called FcIn that binds to these antibodies and sends them back into circulation instead of allowing them to be cleared. Nipocalimab blocks that receptor. It doesn't suppress the immune system broadly. It doesn't stop the antibodies from being produced. It cuts off their recycling mechanism. It starves them of the pathway that keeps them in circulation. And without that recycling, the autoantibody levels fall. The attack on the glands loses its supply line. In phase 2 trials, patients showed statistically significant improvement in disease activity compared to placebo. And the response began appearing as early as week 4 of treatment. 4 weeks. In a disease where people have spent years without any targeted intervention, results appearing in 4 weeks represent a fundamentally different conversation about what treatment can look like. 3 drugs. 3 different mechanisms. All targeting the immune process that drives the disease. All producing results that this disease has never seen before. The old model: manage the symptoms. Eye drops. Saliva spray. Anti-inflammatories. Maintain quality of life while the disease does what it does. The new model: target the mechanism. This is not an incremental upgrade. This is a structural shift in how this disease is being understood and fought. And it's happening right now. Quietly. In journals and trial registries that most patients will never see. The science has already moved. What hasn't moved yet, not nearly fast enough, is the awareness. Here's what I want to add, because it's the part that connects everything else. Sjögren's disease doesn't look the same at every point in its progression. It has stages. And the stage you're in determines almost everything: what your symptoms look like, what your tests show, what's available to you, and what the trajectory looks like if nothing changes. Most people never learn this. Even people who have a diagnosis. Even people who've been in the rheumatology system for years. Because the stage-based framework for Sjögren's is not in standard clinical communication. It's in research literature. It's informing the design of the clinical trials I just described. But it's not in the leaflet handed at diagnosis. It's not in the follow-up appointment. It's not in the search results. And yet it matters more than almost anything else in determining what happens next. Stage 1, subclinical. The autoimmune process has begun, but the damage hasn't crossed the threshold of clinical detectability. Immune cells have begun infiltrating the salivary and lacrimal glands, but gland function hasn't dropped far enough to flag a clinical investigation. What you might notice: subtle neurological symptoms. Tingling. Sleep disruption. Fatigue that doesn't quite fit. A kind of baseline unwellness that doesn't have a name. What the tests show: often nothing. ANA negative. Anti-SSA, SSB negative. Inflammatory markers normal. This is the stage where the diagnostic gap is widest. Where people are most likely to be told they're fine. And where the window for preserving gland function, before irreversible damage accumulates, is widest. Stage 2, early symptomatic. Gland function has begun to drop measurably. Dryness is becoming noticeable. Neurological symptoms are becoming more consistent. Joint involvement may be beginning. Tests may still be negative, or show borderline findings. But if a salivary gland biopsy or ultrasound is performed at this stage, it is likely to show the immune cell infiltration that is the diagnostic hallmark of Sjögren's. This is the stage where a correct diagnosis is achievable. Where the new targeted treatments would potentially be most impactful. Where intervention most clearly changes the trajectory. Stage 3, established disease. Gland damage is now clinically significant. Saliva production measurably reduced. Tear film unstable. Dryness is constant, not intermittent. Systemic involvement is more likely to be present and detectable. This is where most people currently receive their Sjögren's diagnosis. After years of symptoms. After significant accumulated damage. After the window for preserving earlier gland function has narrowed considerably. Stage 4, advanced systemic. Significant systemic involvement. Neuropathy that has progressed beyond subclinical. Possible organ involvement. Elevated lymphoma risk. Sjögren's carries an approximately 5% lifetime risk of developing lymphoma, significantly higher than the general population. This is the stage that is most preventable if the earlier stages are caught and treated. The reason I'm laying this out is not to frighten anyone. It's because most people, at whatever stage they are in, don't know which stage they are in. And that information changes everything about what questions to ask, what tests to push for, and what is actually available. If you want the full breakdown of these patterns, I've put together a symptom map that shows how this progresses, stage by stage. What appears at each point. What the tests show and don't show. Where people tend to get stuck. Type symptom map in the comments and I'll send you the guide so you can see exactly where you are in this pattern. Because most people don't realize which stage they are in until it's already advanced. And that's the part that changes everything. Here's the part one find most important. The science has moved. In the last 3 years, research on Sjögren's disease has advanced more than it did in the previous 3 decades. The first phase 3 trial results that have ever been positive in this disease's history. New understanding of the immune mechanisms driving it. New tools for catching it earlier. This is not a disease that medicine has given up on. Not anymore. But the awareness, among patients, among GPS, among the general public who might recognize these symptoms in themselves or someone they love, has not moved at the same pace. There is an enormous gap between what is happening in the research community and what is reaching the people who need it most. Part of that is structural. A phase 3 trial result published in a rheumatology journal in November 2025 does not automatically translate into a changed conversation between a GP and a patient in January 2026. It takes years for new findings to permeate clinical protocols and standard practice. Part of it is media. A phase 3 trial result in an autoimmune disease, even an historically significant one, is not the kind of story mainstream outlets pick up and explain to a general audience. Part of it is the disease itself. Sjögren's has a visibility problem. It doesn't have the cultural footprint of MS or lupus. It doesn't have a ribbon most people recognize. It is, in many ways, invisible. Which is ironic for a disease that is so frequently missed. And that invisibility has consequences. It means someone going through the diagnostic process doesn't have the cultural context to connect their experience to a named condition. They don't recognize the pattern because the pattern has never been presented to them in accessible terms. It means GPS, stretched and time-limited and working within protocol-driven systems, don't have the atypical presentation flagged in their training in a way that creates the right clinical suspicion. It means the people who most need to know that something is changing, that treatments are coming, that diagnosis is possible, that the framework for understanding this disease is shifting, are the last to find out. This is exactly why this conversation matters. Because awareness is what shrinks the gap between a symptom starting and a diagnosis being reached. Awareness is what gives someone the language to push back in an appointment and ask for the specific tests that standard protocol won't automatically order. Awareness is what tells someone, this is a known pattern. I am not alone in this. There is a name for it. And there are people working on it right now. I want to close this with something that is genuinely, carefully, factually hopeful. The 3 drugs I described, ianalumab, telitacicept, nipocalimab, are not the ceiling of what is coming. They are the beginning of a new chapter. Researchers are now working on salivary gland gene therapy, experimental approaches that aim to deliver therapeutic genes directly to the damaged glands, instructing them to resume normal function. Not symptom management. Not immune suppression. Actual gland restoration. This is early work. Years from clinical application. But the fact that it is being funded and studied represents a shift in what researchers believe is achievable. Neurostimulation is being explored as a mechanism for triggering tear and saliva production through direct nerve activation, bypassing the damaged glands entirely to stimulate production through the neural pathways that control them. Precision medicine approaches, using individual biomarker profiles to identify which subtype of Sjögren's a person has and which therapeutic target is most likely to work for them, are beginning to move from research concept to clinical trial design. The disease is being disaggregated. Instead of treating Sjögren's as a single uniform condition, researchers are beginning to understand it as a spectrum of related conditions with different predominant mechanisms. The drug that works for predominantly B-cell-driven disease may not work as well for predominantly T-cell involvement. The seronegative patient may respond differently from the patient with high anti-SSA levels. Personalizing the treatment approach to the individual immune profile is the direction this is heading. And that direction, toward precision, toward mechanism, toward restoring rather than just managing, represents something the Sjögren's community has not had before. A genuine trajectory. Not hope as a coping mechanism. Hope as a factual assessment of where the science is going. So here's where we are. A disease that affects tens of millions of people worldwide. One of the most commonly underdiagnosed autoimmune conditions in existence. A condition that spent over a century without a single approved treatment. And right now, quietly, in trial data and research journals, that is changing. The first drugs to show real, statistically significant, reproducible results in phase 3 trials are heading toward regulatory submission. The understanding of how this disease works, at the cellular, molecular, immunological level, has advanced beyond anything the previous decade produced. The testing tools to catch it earlier exist. The staging framework to understand where someone is in their progression exists. The biological rationale for why viral illness might trigger or unmask it in susceptible individuals exists. What is lagging, what has always lagged in this disease, is the translation of that knowledge into the hands of the people who need it most. That is what this conversation is part of. If you've been told everything is normal but you don't feel normal, you now know why that happens. You know about the seronegative cases. You know about the tests that are not being ordered. You know about the neurological symptoms that precede the classic presentation. You know about the staging framework that puts your experience in context. And you know that the science, finally, has moved. If you want the full breakdown of these patterns, stage by stage, symptom by symptom, what shows up and when and what the tests are most likely to miss, I've put together a symptom map. Type symptom map in the comments and I'll send it to you. If your tests came back normal but something in this video matched your experience, type normal in the comments and I'll send you the guide that shows exactly what to ask for next. Because most people don't realize which stage they are in until it's already advanced. And knowing where you are, is the thing that changes what's possible. If something in this video sounded familiar, that's not a coincidence. Pay attention to that.